U.S. military intelligence strongly suspects tonight that a surface-to-air missile brought down a Malaysian Airlines jetliner today as it flew at 33,000 feet over the war zone in eastern Ukraine. Flight 17, with 295 people on board, crashed near the Russian border, where pro-Russian Ukrainian rebels are battling to break away from Ukraine. There are no survivors. Just yesterday, the rebels claimed responsibility for downing a Ukrainian military jet. A Ukrainian military transport plane was shot down on Monday. But this evening, the rebels, who are backed by Russia, insist they had nothing to do with today's crash of the airliner. This video captured the fire just moments after the Malaysia Airlines Boeing 777 fell in pieces from the sky. Smoke billowed from a village held by Ukrainian rebels about 25 miles from the Russian border. Wreckage, body parts, and personal belongings were scattered over miles. Flight 17 took off from Amsterdam at about 6:30 Eastern Time this morning, bound for Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Less than 4 hours into the flight, it disappeared from radar. The 295 people on board included 280 passengers and a crew of 15. Some of their relatives gathered at airports in Amsterdam and in Kuala Lumpur, where the plane had been scheduled to land about 6 Eastern Time this evening. We have a team of correspondents covering this rapidly developing story. First, we'll go to National Security Correspondent David Martin at the Pentagon. David?
Scott, one of the scenarios being investigated is that the rebels were trying to shoot down a Ukrainian military transport plane and hit the airliner by mistake. This is the missile system the Ukrainian government says shot down the Malaysian airliner. It is a sophisticated weapon composed of radars, command vehicles, and missile launchers. Not a weapon a rebel army like the separatists in eastern Ukraine would be expected to own or be able to operate. But it is listed as being in the inventory of the Ukrainian military. It is possible a unit, along with its operators, was seized by the separatists when they overran Ukrainian military bases. It could also have been fired by Russians, either operating inside eastern Ukraine or from their own territory. It is made by a Russian company which has advertised its capabilities with this animation showing how it could shoot down what looks like an American F-35 jet fighter, a much more difficult target than an airliner.
Good afternoon.
Just yesterday, President Obama included the manufacturer on a list of companies targeted by new sanctions aimed to punish Russia for its support of the separatist fighters in eastern Ukraine. Analysts are still going through a mass of data collected by radars and satellites and expect to be able to pinpoint the exact location from which the missile was fired.
Brennan, our State Department correspondent, has been talking with her sources all day. Margaret?
Well, Scott, since the beginning of this conflict in Ukraine nearly 6 months ago, both sides have really aggressively posted propaganda and accused one another of causing the tension. But the Obama administration says there is clear evidence that Russia is providing the separatists with military support, actions that it has warned could have fatal consequences.
Moments after the tragedy, Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko said it was not an accident, but an act of terrorism. Ukraine's government said the airliner had been shot down by a missile and claimed there was evidence of Russian military involvement. Then pointed to comments made on Twitter by separatist leader Igor Girkin, who earlier took credit for shooting down a military aircraft. He warned, "Do not fly in our skies." Later, Ukraine's security agency released recordings of what it claimed were intercepted phone calls between a Russian intelligence officer and a separatist leader in Ukraine. We couldn't verify the recording, but a voice is heard saying, "We have just shot down a plane." Another separatist leader denied the rebels had a missile capable of bringing down an aircraft, and he blamed the Ukrainian armed forces.
Tonight, the Kremlin is deflecting the blame, and President Putin pointed the finger back at the Ukrainian government, said it was responsible for what he has called a terrible tragedy.
Major development tonight Israeli troops have launched an invasion of Gaza. The 32-mile Gaza Strip is a homeland for Palestinians displaced by the creation of Israel. Over the last 10 days, Islamic militants have fired hundreds of unguided rockets into Israel, killing one civilian. And Israel has responded with airstrikes that have killed 240 Palestinians and wounded more than 1,800, nearly all of them civilians. Israel has occupied Gaza often over the decades. Holly Williams is in Gaza tonight. Holly, what are you seeing?
Well, Scott, the sky here tonight in Gaza has been lit up over and over again as Israel pounds this tiny strip of land with its airstrikes. This is the heaviest bombardment we've seen during this escalation, and it comes as the Israeli media reports that tens of thousands of Israeli soldiers have now entered the Gaza Strip, backed by tanks and bulldozers. Now, Israel has been threatening a ground offensive for days, calling up nearly 50,000 reservists and massing troops and moving columns of tanks to the border. But it looks as though initially at first this offensive will be quite limited and will target tunnels that are used by Palestinian militants to infiltrate Israeli territory. Now, the Israeli military says it foiled an attack overnight by 13 militants who were trying to sneak into Israel, and that it killed at least one of them with an airstrike on the mouth of the tunnel. Now, Israel says it is that attack, as well as rocket attacks by Palestinian militants during what was supposed to be a brief humanitarian ceasefire today, that has forced it to act to defend its own citizens. Officials here in Gaza say that more than 230 Palestinians have been killed during these airstrikes, and we expect to see many, many more casualties tomorrow. During that same period, the militants have fired more than 1,000 of their rockets into southern Israel, killing one person. We talked this evening with a spokesman for Hamas, that's the militant group that runs the Gaza Strip, and he vowed to make Israel pay dearly, in his words, for sending its troops into the Gaza Strip. Scott?
Israeli armor moving in tonight. Holly Williams. Thank you, Holly. As it happens, the crash of Flight 17 today comes on the anniversary of another air disaster. It was 18 years ago tonight that TWA Flight 800 exploded in midair off the south shore of Long Island, New York. All 230 people on board were killed. There were theories that the plane had been shot down, but investigators finally concluded it was a fuel tank explosion caused by an electrical spark. This evening, Russian President Putin said Ukraine bears responsibility for the tragedy because of the continuing civil war. The U.S. supports the Ukrainian government in its fight against the rebels. Major Garrett is covering all of this from the White House tonight. Major?
Scott, on his way to New York City for a fundraiser and a political meeting, President Obama telephoned Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko to offer condolences and U.S. assistance with the crash investigation. Both presidents said it was crucial that evidence at the crash site remain in place so international investigators can determine the facts. But other than that, it was business as usual for Mr. Obama. His remarks in Delaware, as scheduled, focused on improving substandard roads and bridges. This afternoon, the president arrived in Manhattan for 2 political meetings. And as you noted, Scott, all this comes less than 24 hours after the United States slapped a 3rd round of economic sanctions against Russia, targeting 2 large Russian banks, 2 large energy firms, and 8 Russian arms manufacturers.
Major, we understand this evening the president's been meeting with his national security team. What have you heard from that?
That meeting was by phone, Scott. A conference call the president just wrapped up with his national security team, and he delivered them one mandate: provide as much U.S. assistance and advance as rapidly as possible a believable, neutral international investigation to determine the facts on the ground in Ukraine.
Major Garrett at the White House for us. Major, thank you. Today, Charlie Rose interviewed former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. One of the topics that came up was the Malaysian Airlines crash.
So what does the United States do if there is a clear indication and clear evidence that it was Russian separatists and perhaps using weapons from Russia?
I think that the first question is, what does Europe do? Right. I think the United States has been very clear in both its criticism of Russia and Putin. If there is evidence linking Russia to this, that should inspire the Europeans to do much more on 3 counts. 1, toughen their own sanctions, make it very clear there has to be a price to pay. Number 2, immediately accelerate efforts and announce they are doing so to find alternatives to Gazprom. And thirdly, do more in concert with us to support the Ukrainians and to put Putin on notice that he has gone too far and we are not going to stand idly by.
U.S. military intelligence strongly suspects that a surface-to-air missile brought down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 in Ukraine today. The second disaster for this airline this year. Flight 370 is still missing, presumably somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Flight 17 today was en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when it crashed in eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian rebels are fighting the government. There were 295 people on board, 280 passengers, and a crew of 15. There are no survivors. Bob Orr is in Washington with the latest on this. Bob?
Scott, as you say, U.S. officials now strongly suspect the jetliner was brought down by some kind of surface-to-air missile. But so far, they tell us it's not clear who fired it, or more importantly, whether the passenger jet was being deliberately targeted. Now, some of the answers will ultimately come through intelligence, but also some will have to come from the wreckage and the plane's black boxes. For starters, as you see here, the trail of debris clearly shows that the jet began breaking up in midair. Wreckage and bodies are spread over several miles along the flight path, and that would be consistent with the plane being ripped apart by aerodynamic forces after the aircraft was penetrated by some kind of high explosive projectile, like a missile. Large sections of the jet have been recovered now away from the primary crash site. At the impact crater itself, the wreckage is more pulverized and charred. That suggests the plane hit the ground at a very high rate of speed and then was engulfed in a very large fire. Remember, the fuel tanks in the wings were heavily loaded for an 11-hour flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, so there was a lot of fuel available. It's not clear who's going to take part in the investigation of this incident, but Ukraine likely needs to bring in some high-powered expertise, perhaps from the U.S. or Great Britain. Aviation structure and fire experts, among other things, will need to examine the aircraft wreckage. They'll look for residue of a missile propellant and also evidence that the jet's skin was punctured inward by a high-speed impact. It's imperative the experts also get a chance to read out the black boxes, because the boxes should be able to confirm that in the end this was no aircraft accident and that the pilots were caught completely unaware by a missile strike. Big questions going forward, Scott. Who did it and why?
Bob, do you think the United States will be part of the investigation on the ground?
I know they're willing to do that, Scott. They've got some of the best experts in the world, but they have to be invited in by the Ukraine government. It's important that whatever the finding is, that it's factual and that it's credible and accepted. The U.S. experts could add that kind of power.
The U.S., of course, is supporting the Ukraine government, but the crash site is in rebel-held territory. Bob Orr, thank you very much.
Unions and managers of the Long Island Railroad have reached a tentative contract agreement averting a strike that stood to inconvenience hundreds of thousands of riders. Governor Andrew Cuomo, who guided the negotiations, called the agreement a compromise.
Compromise, by definition, means that neither side gets everything that they wanted to get, but it means that we reach an agreement and we can move forward.
The compromise means all employees will contribute to health insurance costs, and new employees would work under different wage and pension provisions. The contract would give employees 17% raises over 6.5 years.
This definitely is a fair contract. It's a compromise by all parties to make sure that we continue down the road of a safe and reliable system.
Approximately 300,000 riders use the railroad daily. News of an agreement was welcomed at Penn Station.
I was going to work from home. I don't know how long that would have lasted, but I definitely think it would have been difficult if I had to drive in like most of my other coworkers.
I think it's great. I don't have to worry about how I'm getting to work. Working from home, I can come in and I love it.
Officials said the agreement, which still needs to be ratified, will not require an increase in fares.
I think you've handled this, as I said in my opening statement, with courage and conviction, have stepped forward. I cannot for the life of me. This is either gross negligence or gross incompetence on the part of a lawyer. The notion that he can say, I didn't know.
Senator McCaskill, I respectfully disagree. As you know, I have made the promise to fix what happened in the company, to make sure that we are dedicated to safety, that we're dedicated to excellence. We are well on our way. We've made significant change. To do that, I need the right team. And Mike Milliken is a man of incredibly high integrity. He has tremendous global experience as it relates to the legal profession. He's the person I need on this team. He had a system in place. Unfortunately, in this instant, it wasn't brought to his attention, frankly, by people who brought many other issues forward. We're the OEM. We're the company that's responsible to integrate the parts into the vehicle, so it's our responsibility. In my career at General Motors, I've never accepted the GM nod, and frankly, I've called people out on it because it's not appropriate. I mean, we make a very complex product, and it's important that all voices are heard. So, the way that you change culture is by demonstrating the behavior, making sure people understand what your expectations are, and calling them out when they don't. And I've been demonstrating that. I will tell you, our leadership team, my direct leadership team is 100% committed to that. And I've talked openly about it. When I talked to all employees globally on June 5th, after I read the Lucas report, which I found deeply troubling, I told them that. And I told them that behavior was unacceptable. We weren't going to tolerate it. But the true change will be by behaviors, and I'm intent on making sure the right behaviors continue going forward.
Some terrifying moments in California. 3 bank robbers take hostages, lead police on a wild chase. When it was over, 3 people dead, including one of the hostages. ABC's David Wright is in Los Angeles with the latest. Good morning, David.
Good morning, George. An incredible scene. And this morning, Stockton, California is still reeling from it. Almost every squad car in town chasing this group of bank robbers, extra rounds of ammo taped to their bodies and using hostages as human shields. This was truly the Wild West. In Stockton, California, a bank heist straight out of the movies that led to this deadly chase through city streets and neighborhoods at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour.
The cop went flying through the intersection. We jumped back onto the sidewalk.
It all started Wednesday afternoon at this Bank of the West branch. Authorities say 3 robbers made off with money and 3 female hostages. Misty Holsing's cousin says Misty was one of them and that her daughter watched in horror as the robbers dragged her mother away.
She was just going to pull out money. She left her kid in the car. Her daughter has to text her husband saying, hey, they took mom.
Police say the suspect stole a bank employee's SUV and fired AK-47 type assault weapons at police cars in hot pursuit. The hostages there in the car with them. At least 14 other cars struck with stray bullets.
The actions of the dangerous criminals today was beyond reckless and chaotic. No words can describe it.
Police say during the chase, 2 of the hostages were tossed out of the getaway car. One of them shot and injured. This cell phone video shows one of the hostages on the road.
Her leg was all tore up and bleeding.
After more than an hour's chase, it all ended in a bloody shootout, heard on this cell phone video. In the end, a weapon on the ground, the SUV riddled with bullet holes. All 3 alleged bank robbers shot, 2 of them killed. That 3rd hostage was also killed. Police say the hostage who was killed, that mother, Misty Holsing, was used as a human shield during that final shootout. And eyewitnesses say the scene looked like a war. Continuous gunfire for 5 straight minutes. The other 2 hostages have been hospitalized. No word this morning on their condition, but they must be very shaken.
brand new study of a vitamin in many medicine cabinets that could be dangerous. Niacin, also known as vitamin B3, is a popular treatment for people trying to control cholesterol. But this study suggests the side effects could outweigh the benefits. Our senior medical contributor, Dr. Jen Ashton, here to explain. And this is bad news for niacin.
Absolutely, George. Here's the actual study right here. Some cardiologists are calling this a landmark study. What they did is they looked at a group of patients already with cardiovascular disease. They put some of them on a combination drug, niacin or vitamin B3, with an anti-flushing drug, compared them to placebo. And what they found was that while niacin did improve their numbers, it dropped their bad cholesterol, their LDL, it raised their good cholesterol. It did not prevent end events like heart attack and stroke. And check out these side effects. They were significant. The patients on this high dose, 2,000 milligrams of niacin, had gastrointestinal issues, diabetes, infection, bleeding. These are significant. Merck funded this study, George. This was not good news for niacin.
These are definitely side effects. You couldn't have a gastro situation.
These are known side effects, Lara. We've known for a while that niacin can do this, but again, how much and to what extent wasn't really delineated before this study.
People think it's niacin, it's a vitamin, it must be safe to take. Is there a dosage that is safe?
Well, look, the recommended daily allowance for this vitamin is between 14 and 16 milligrams. These patients were on 2,000 milligrams.
Wow.
But think of it like this. Yes, it's a vitamin. Yes, it can be available over the counter. Yes, it's natural, quote unquote. But be clear, there are always risks. And in medicine, we always have to weigh the risks versus the benefits. And remember, the premise of medicine is first, do no harm.
I just have to ask, yes, no. Would you tell patients to take it?
In this dosage, absolutely not. Way too risky.
Okay.
Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Brazil is his first state visit to the South American country since taking office. The visit is taking special importance as 2014 marks the 40th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Brazil. Bilateral ties in all fields have been developing constantly over the past 4 decades. CCTV's Zhong Shi takes a look.
China and Brazil, the largest developing countries in their respective hemisphere. Despite the distance, China and Brazil ties have grown remarkably closer since the two countries established diplomatic ties in 1974. China and Brazil have strengthened their political ties when they established a strategic partnership in 1993, which was promoted to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2012. The two countries have also promoted the confidence of developing countries to participate in global affairs. Economically, there has been a natural symmetry between China's export-focused industrial economy and Brazil's economy, which is primarily an industrial commodities provider. Trade flows between the two countries rose to over $90 billion in 2013, making them the biggest partners within the member nations of BRICS. Since 2009, China has replaced the U.S. as Brazil's main trading partner. Likewise, Brazil is China's largest trading partner in Latin America and a key destination of Chinese foreign direct investment. Yet cooperation between the two countries has gone well beyond trade and politics. It's also encompassing areas such as language teaching and learning. 5 Confucius Institutes have been established in Brazil since 2008. Many say these interactions will bring China and Brazil, which are geographically distant and culturally distinct, even closer in the future.
This audit will take 3 to 4 weeks. Once the audit ends, the report will be given to the Electoral Complaint Commission.
295 people aboard Malaysia 17 came from many nations. Who were they? Here's Don Daler with what we know so far.
Bodies and debris is scattered over almost 6 square miles. People from the nearby village are gathering personal effects. Here, a tourist guide to Bali. There, passports telling of where some of the travelers came from, the Netherlands, Malaysia. What the passports don't say is who is left behind. Loved ones and friends and co-workers, many of whom gathered at the Amsterdam and Kuala Lumpur airports to find out what they could and grieve together. Most of the passengers were European, including 154 from the Netherlands, but there were also Australians, Malaysians, Indonesians, and Filipinos, also a Canadian. We are just now learning about some of the victims. The father of flight attendant Nur Shazana Maud Saleh went on social media to say, "She is my daughter. Pray that she is safe. She is single, hoping to get her married soon. She felt that this month is special for her." And a woman told a Malaysian newspaper her 67-year-old sister was on the flight. She'd been living in Switzerland and had not been home to Malaysia in 5 years. She was returning to attend a religious holiday.
The nationality of 62 passengers is still unclear. Scott, the Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur flight is popular with Europeans going on vacation in the South Pacific.
And repeating, there are no survivors, and we don't yet know whether there were Americans on board. Don, thanks very much.
Reports coming out of the Gaza Strip say Palestinian fighters continued their retaliatory operations, including an infiltration into Israel ahead of the 5-hour ceasefire. A group of Hamas commandos crossed into Israel via a tunnel that runs from the south of the besieged Gaza Strip. The military wing of Hamas, known as the Qassam Brigades, has claimed responsibility for the operation. It says all its men have returned safely to Gaza after completing the mission. This casts doubt on the authenticity of an Israeli video showing resistance fighters coming under a heavy air bombardment. The Israeli military claimed it repelled the attack and wounded many of the fighters. Israeli sources say the mission was the biggest infiltration operation since the creation of the regime. The Palestinian-American teenager who was brutally beaten by masked Israeli police in East Jerusalem Al-Quds has returned to the U.S. Here's what he had to say upon his arrival.
You only know my story because I'm an American, but I hope you will all also remember my cousin, a 16-year-old Palestinian named Muhammad Abu Khdir. He was just a kid like me, and this whole thing started because he was killed. I know he must have been terrified like I was. I was in a new place and suddenly attacked by masked police. It was by far the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. Thank you so much. I feel really
Tariq Abu Qudayr traveled with his family to the occupied East Jerusalem Al-Quds on vacation in early June. A video showing masked Israeli police brutally beating him sparked outrage both in the U.S. and the Palestinian territories. His family says Tariq has been denied medical treatment since he was arrested and taken into custody. Tariq is a cousin of Muhammad Abu Qudayr, who was abducted and then burned alive at the wake of the disappearance and later killing of 3 Israeli settlers on the West Bank. Meanwhile, Tariq's mother has addressed a cheering crowd at the airport, highlighting the agony of the Palestinians living under Israeli occupation.
Who stayed with Tariq's story. I hope you will not forget what happened to my son, and I hope you will also remember that my nephew Muhammad, who does not have an American citizenship, is dead. 36 children in Gaza and counting are dead, and by tomorrow, who knows what the number will be? Who will stand up for these nameless Palestinian children? This is what I want to know. Thank you.
Broadway legend Elaine Stritch was 89 when she died today at her home in Michigan. The gravelly-voiced actress is best remembered for her one-woman show, Elaine Stritch at Liberty, and for her role in the Stephen Sondheim show, Company. Stritch continued to work well into her 80s, playing Alec Baldwin's mother on 30 Rock.